Okay, this week I have a very special guest. His name is Richard Nicol, but you would probably really understand who he is if I say that he's the Pittsburgh Modular guy. Pittsburgh Modulars are kind of everywhere. I have a little Foundation 2 system that I use when I'm teaching. A lot of people use them as starter systems, but a lot of people are using them throughout their rigs. They're super popular. And so with that, I want to say hello to Richard. Hi, Richard. How are you today?
Hello, I'm well. A good day at the shop today.
Oh, fantastic. So why don't we start off by having you tell people what you do instead of me just calling you the Pittsburgh guy. You can kind of fill in the blanks of what it is that you actually do with the company.
Sure. Well, I'm the owner. I'm the founder of Pittsburgh Modular. I started the company 3.5 years ago now, and we make mostly analog synthesizers. Everything is fully modular. So the idea was you take a synthesizer and you chop it up into its individual components, and that allows the user to sort of put it together in ways that maybe the designers and the engineers hadn't thought of. So it's really a great way to explore sound design and come up with something that's really uniquely you. So that was sort of the idea behind the company. Really, it was just me kind of scratching my itch as a creator. I wanted to do something interesting. I was a software developer for 15 years, and staring at databases all day, I got burned out. And so I started fiddling with electronics as a hobby, and it sort of grew and grew. And I thought, well, if I can sell one or two of these things, maybe I could buy another brand's module without spending a whole lot of my own money. And so I came up with a simple DIY module that I thought, okay, this is interesting enough someone might buy. So I called a couple dealers. I said, hey, I've got this product. Or would you be interested in buying a couple to sell in your store? And right away, within the first week, I think I had 50 or 60 orders.
Wow.
So right out of the gate, there was a ton of interest, and I was doing the stuff in my basement and working during the day doing databases and then putting modules together at night, and it just sort of slowly grew from there to the point where I had taken over the entire basement of my house, and you could barely get downstairs to do laundry or anything at that point. So then we moved to the shop, and I quit my day job, and this became 3.5 years ago. This became a company, and now we have. It's been a while, but it was an amazing day. The first day we got a paycheck that said Pittsburgh Modular on it.
Right, that's
that
awesome.
Was pretty cool because I'd never been, making them was sort of the satisfaction. So it was cool to get paid to do it. But we've been doing this now for quite a while. We're Pittsburgh Modulars. We're the largest company in the United States making these modular synthesizers. We have a very strong reputation. Our product sounds amazing. And, I think it's because it's fun, and we try to transmit a little bit of that fun in our products.
Yeah, I agree. You do a great job of that. The other thing that you do is you really help people get started by creating these foundation systems. I think it's a really critical thing for people to say, I want to experiment, but I don't want to have to worry about getting the things right. So by buying a foundation system, it sort of like jump starts the process. They can begin their experimentation and then run from there.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that was sort of the problem with modular synthesis in general before we got into it, was that it really draws you in as far as, wow, that looks really interesting, but it's very overwhelming. If you would go and buy a system and you bring it home, you plug it in, you turn it on, it doesn't make any sound. You have to understand how the thing works. You have to know how to patch it up. And that's very overwhelming for someone that just spent a lot of money on this instrument that they have no idea how to play. So what we've done, and this was the philosophy from day one, was we need to get the barrier of entry down as low as possible. We need to make it as easy as possible for someone to buy a system and then start making music with it. So we do these fantastic manuals with patch examples
Right.
and explanations of what each module does, what every jack does, and then a patch explaining each module. And over the years, our manuals have gotten better and better because we are selling systems and not just individual modules. We can sort of curate the experience. So if I know what modules you have because you're buying my system, I can then say, oh, try these 10 patches out to give you a real strong idea of how it works. And what that does is, I know no one likes to use manuals, but in this case, I think it's sort of important. And if you give us a couple hours with our manual, you can take off your sort of learning hat and put your musician's hat back on and start making your own patches and start making your own music. And then you're no longer intimidated by the instrument. Instead, you're excited to use it, and it's going to push you in ways that you've never gone before.
Well, I think it's interesting that you talk about the manual as being really important because most people, especially in the modular synthesizer world, treat it as if it doesn't need to exist. And the fact is, I think the reason a lot of people say they don't want to use manuals is because manuals have a history of either being too basic or too complex. And it seems to me like you put the idea of making music ahead of the idea of showing off your modules.
Well, absolutely. Well, at that point, hopefully, someone has either already bought our system or, they've invested the time to go to the website and download the manual. And we've already sort of hooked them at that point.
Right.
If they're interested enough to, even if they haven't bought anything, and they're interested enough to download the manual, that's an opportunity for us to say, you know what, this is how we operate. This is what is important to Pittsburgh Modular. And I think they're going to get it and realize, okay, they're doing this in a way that makes sense. I'm going to take the next step. I'm going to go out and listen to some demos, or I'm going to go out, and order one. A synthesizer, or any musical instrument for that matter, it has to sort of satisfy you visually and sort of mentally, even before you would begin to make music on it. So the manual helps satisfy your mind. It sort of puts you at ease with the instrument. But an instrument also has to be beautiful and easy to understand at the same time, because if you're sitting in your studio or your home office or your bedroom and you have a couple hours to kill and you want to play some music, you're going to look around and you're probably going to have 2 or 3 different instruments to choose from to take a peek at, plus, not including your laptop with all the virtual instruments and everything you can do on a laptop. You're going to pick up the instrument that catches your eye. You're going to pick up the instrument that scratches that part of your brain that you need scratched at that particular point in time. So even before you turn the thing on, you have to feel comfortable around it, and you have to be drawn to it. So the manual is one aspect of that, sort of getting you familiar and comfortable with the instrument. But, the second part of that then is it has to be beautiful. We spent a lot of time even on just the ergonomics and how the thing looks and how each module we make, and we make close to 40 different modules.
Right.
Each one is different. Each one is unique in its layout and certainly what it does. But that's important because as you put these things together, you need to be able to say, I need to change the ADSR. Okay, it's got to be this because this is the only one that could look like that. And so so we're competing for the attention of people, that have the internet and have 5 or 10 synthesizers already in their home. So if we can draw them in, then obviously once you turn it on, you start patching, it has to be an amazing instrument. It sort of has to knock you over with its sounds.
Right.
But even before you get to that point, there's a lot to go into it. And the manual it's an important component because it really tells the world that we're in this as an experience and not just to sell modular synthesizers.
Right. Well, that's a great perspective, and I think it's one of the reasons why you're so successful. I mean, there's a number of reasons, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But one of the things I'm curious about, so you do all the design work for the modules as well as the manufacture and sale, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a suspicion there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that probably have day jobs that are like looking at databases. How does a guy who is doing that, where's the background that you have that allowed you to become a module maker or a manufacturer?
Well, my background is I've been a musician, since junior high. And I've always been fascinated with synthesizers and how they sound, not necessarily how they were made, but certainly how they sounded. And as a software developer, I think working with coding in different programs, I was very easily able to transition to schematics and hardware. Because, blocks of code, I can think of them in the same way that I would think of an op-amp or a transistor, a capacitor. And I was able to sort of shift my understanding of coding into, I would say, a rudimentary understanding of hardware. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, and I don't think that I'll ever be good enough to be a decent electrical engineer, but fortunately in Pittsburgh, there's a tremendous number of really smart people. And I was able to find an engineer, Michael Johnson, who was willing to work with me almost from day one. So I would come up with an idea, and I would sort of, as best I could, draw it out in a schematic. I would call certainly my earlier schematics, the coding perspective, it would be almost like pseudocode,
right,
where you use sort of very generic programming terms to describe what you want to do. That's sort of what I did originally with the schematics. I would kind of draw the schematics as I thought the signal flow should go, but it was very rough. But I would sit down then with Michael Johnson and sort of flesh out the idea, and he would kind of take it from there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had that understanding in the programming and sort of the processes, one thing can happen at a time.
Right.
I think it gave me the ability to sort of shift gears.
Well, it's interesting because what you're talking about actually kind of has a history or a recent history around it. There's actually a conference that some of my coworkers go to called Sketching in Hardware, where that concept of playing around with schematics and playing around with these things as if they're sort of proto software tools. And then once you come up with an idea, finding someone that can help you implement it in sort of like an industrial way, that's becoming a really important part of how designs are created now.
And as I sort of get deeper and deeper into Pittsburgh Modular, I realize, there isn't one person out there that does everything. There's no company that lives on an island and designs everything they make from scratch. There's no way you could be an expert at everything. So I think you have to understand the process enough to be able to ask the right questions and to be able to find the right people to work with.
Sure. Now, in cases where I've spoken to other modular builders, they've had influences, either they were influenced by Bob Moog's work or by Don Buchel's work or by Electronotes or, a lot of different influences. Who would you say was your primary influence in terms of circuit design?
Well, my biggest influence as far as circuit design goes is probably our engineer, Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson is an avant-garde artist. He's been designing his own synthesizers for about 25 years. I think he got an ARP axe one year for Christmas or his birthday. And it just didn't do what he wanted it to do. He felt very constrained by it, very restricted as to what he could do. His family were all engineers and physicists, and they encouraged him, well, what, if it doesn't do what you want to do, then, why don't you try to build something that does what you want to do?
Right.
So as he grew up in a household where, if you needed a tool to do something, you built the tool. So his designs are very unique, and he has a very interesting way of approaching problems that I think is very different than a lot of most synthesizer engineers. So from a hardware standpoint and a design standpoint, that's probably, that's where we come from. But from sort of a more of an East Coast Bob Moog versus West Coast Don Buchla sort of synth flavor.
Right.
Pittsburgh Modular is very firmly rooted on the East Coast Bob Moog side.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer the idea of hooking up a MIDI keyboard and playing the synthesizer in that way.
Right.
As opposed to sort of the modular is the interface side of sort of the West Coast Don Buchla style.
Right.
So we're definitely firmly rooted in the East Coast philosophy. But there's so many amazing engineers, and when you start to look at, not necessarily on the circuitry level, but when you sort of assess the ideas of, Don Buchla and all the old great ARP stuff, like the ARP 2600, and, Bob Moog stuff, the earlier Bob Moog stuff and the Dave Smith stuff, you start to realize that in each one of these synths, there's always something that's really unique and really great about it. So, for the layman looking at synthesizers saying, oh, they all sound the same and they all look the same. Well, I guess they kind of do in a very broad sense. But when you start to get in there and see that, oh, Dave has this great filter and he has this great technology, he can do polyphony, where Moog is all monophonic. But Moog has this amazing Moog sound that they've been sort of refining over the last 50 years.
Right.
And you look at Don Buchla circuit, it seems like he lived his entire life in a bubble, and he built stuff that interested him, and it's so different and so unique. And you can sort of take little flavors from here and flavors from there and create something that is, in our case, uniquely Pittsburgh.
Sure.
So we can sort of stand on the shoulder of these giants and do something that is uniquely us, without, the Eurorack community. A lot of people will, there's a lot of very small manufacturers, and what they'll do is they'll have one or two modules that they make, and that's great. But a lot of them are simply, go to the internet and type in transistor ladder filter schematic.
Right.
And you put that on a PCB, and now you have your first module.
Right.
And you're not really adding anything to the sum of human knowledge doing that.
Sure.
And that really doesn't interest us. We want to do something that we can be proud of that we did.
Right. Well, and I would say one of the things that I find interesting about the Pittsburgh modules is that they, on the surface, they look like real solid, real straightforward East Coast style modules, right? But as I work with them, each one of them seems to have their little idiosyncratic behaviors, like, something as simple as the LFO2, it's got, there's two different speeds, and they can kind of, you mix them together and you get some very interesting LFO interactions because of the dual nature of it. Those are some really interesting things, and it really is sort of like how you help people get from the most basic patches into stuff that's more interesting. I think that that's key. Now, I'm curious, you talk about how different manufacturers have things that set them apart in terms of, the sonic quality or something. What would you say are the things that make Pittsburgh systems unique? What do you consider your shining stars?
Well, you can't go wrong with the filter module, proudly called filter, because we worked really hard on it, and we only ever wanted to make one. It was really important that if we were to come out with a filter, that it would define what Pittsburgh sounded like. Right. And we weren't going to have 6 different types. So the filter that we came out with, it's a state variable filter. The state variable filter architecture, the core architecture, has been around for long before synthesizers were around. It was used in testing equipment long before people decided it was cool if you ran saw waves through it. What we've added to it and what we've implemented around this core architecture really speaks to you as a musician. The filter is warm and creamy, and we like the idea that there's no sweet spot, that you can take the frequency knob and sweep the entire frequency range, and it all sounds good. We added a custom resonance circuit that it won't start to self-oscillate, but you can push it really, really hard to get this really great, almost sort of tweaky 303 vibe out of it, but also pull it back and just get cream all day long out of it. That said, it's sort of a Jekyll and Hyde because you can flip the switch and go to oscillator mode, where the resonance then will self-oscillate, and you essentially have a sine wave oscillator that begins competing with the incoming signal to just get these fantastic overdriven tones, where it ends up being almost whatever wave you put in it, you just get this brutal square wave textures out of it.
Right.
So but like you were saying, how all of our modules kind of have a second layer of functionality to them, the filter certainly does as well. There's one switch that said the gain of 1 or the gain of Q switch, and it's probably the least understood function of all of our modules. And really what it does is it changes the response of the resonance, so that if you are, as you are increasing the resonance level, it will decrease or not decrease the overall amplitude of the output. So you can use that as a resonance-based VCA. You can do some really cool stuff, so like hitting it with an envelope, and do some interesting things you can't do with anything else. So we like to sprinkle in these extra features on top of, what the most important thing is, sound quality. And the filter really, I think, shines through is one of our best modules. It really represents what Pittsburgh wants to be.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's an amazing filter, and frankly, it's one of those things that I see that even people who aren't like dedicated to Pittsburgh Modular systems often will have the Pittsburgh filter in there because it is such a unique and beautiful sounding part of the instrument. Now, right now, I want to talk a little bit about your current set of modules, because first of all, where you used to be doing things that were very solidly East Coast, ADSR envelopes, basic VCAs, basic VCOs, a basic linear mixer, you've started branching out. I noticed that you now have AR envelope things. Your oscillators now are a little more complex. You have some other like tool modules that are providing a little more complexity. What's the drive behind that? Is it just so that you can provide people with lots of options, or was it with some specific goals in mind? Because I would say that some of the early things that you did that really remind me of West Coast work was sort of like the generator and the gen expander combo. I mean, that kind of had, I wouldn't even say West Coast. That was just idiosyncratic and weird and fun, right? So it strikes me that while you frame yourself as being kind of doing things firmly East Coast, you have the devil on your shoulder there somewhere where you're doing a little crazy stuff too. Is there kind of a master plan behind that, or is it just something you do because you love doing it?
Well, there is a little bit of a master plan behind it, but a lot of it is just, we make modules that we want to use.
Right.
And talking about the envelope modules is a great example for this. The envelope module is based off a surge module called the dual slope generator. There's been a lot of Eurorack modules based off that design. The Make Noise Maths was based off that design. And there's a bunch of other modules that almost clone component for component the surge dual slope generator. The functionality of the module, though, is great. Serge, he came up with a great idea, and it's very interesting. But like I said, and it's an extremely West Coast idea. A slope generator can essentially be a couple different things at one time. It can be an envelope generator, so it can be an attack decay or an attack release. But because you have voltage control, it can re-trigger. What that means is you can also do oscillators with it, because as soon as you hit the end of the decay phase, then it just re-triggers the attack. So you essentially create oscillations with it. And you can do some other stuff, like envelope following and that kind of stuff with it. We were just sort of fascinated by the functionality and how it worked. But like I said, because we are firmly rooted in the East Coast, we wanted to put it within the context of the East Coast. So what we did was we took the functionality and we said, how can we package this, and how can we design a module that is sort of an East Coast version of this? Mm-hmm. So what we did was we kind of started from scratch, and we said, well, okay, here's the points we want to hit. So we have the envelope, so we can do an attack decay or an attack release. But to bring it further onto the East Coast, then we said, well, let's add a sustain switch to it. So now you have a fully functioning envelope, a very East Coast style envelope.
Right.
But you have voltage control over the attack, and you have voltage control over the release and the decay. So you still have the cycle, so you can do the LFO stuff and the crazier West Coast stuff. But it's also very at home in the East Coast, more traditional keyboard setup.
Right.
So we try to straddle both sides with modules like that. I like to say we're bringing the best of the West to the East side and incorporating it. And that's really what we're trying to do, certainly with the envelope module. With our new oscillators, it's called the waveforms. I came up with this, in my infinite ability to break things. I was prototyping something, and I came up with this fantastic mistake that ended up giving me this great waveform that we call the blade wave.
Okay.
Which is a modulatable saw wave. So you can modulate a saw wave almost in the same way that you can pulse width a square wave. Mm-hmm. So you get this living, breathing saw. It's really great sounding, big, beefy sounding saw wave, almost like a chorus vibe to it.
Right.
And we wanted to incorporate that into our oscillator. Now, our oscillators are a bit different than most people's. We don't calibrate our oscillators to a oscilloscope because musicians don't play music to oscilloscopes, so we always thought that was crazy. We have a sound that we go for, and we calibrate our oscillators to that sound. So if you look at our sine waves are really ugly. Yeah. The bottoms are bigger than the tops, and they're not really sine waves at all. But they sound huge, and right. They give you this massive bottom end. So the waveform oscillator, it's really still very East Coast, but we've added a sub oscillator, and we've added this blade wave that you can modulate it in really unique ways. So we've really just expanded East Coast from the 4 or 5 basic waveforms to add some more flavors to it.
I see. Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
And a lot of times, certainly with a lot of those West Coast, style oscillators, really it's just 2 oscillators and how they modulate each other.
Right.
So if you would take even 2 East Coast style, 2 of our waveforms, put them in, just have one modulating the other, you're going to get sounds that are almost identical.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I have in my primary performance rig, I have 2 of the original Pittsburgh oscillators, but I had my friend Chris Blarski modified them to use 10-turn pots, and which really makes it kind of fun from being able to do really long and slow sweeps that are, but also to really fine tune quite easily. But those 2 ended up actually replacing a Make Noise DPO for me, because I found that in fact, just cross-oscillating or cross-modulating them gave me as wild as I needed to, but being able to do that fine-tuning and frankly, I just that is a sawtooth wave based oscillator, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. I find often that I really like the sound and the timbre that comes from a saw-based oscillator rather than a triangle. And so for me, it was sort of like I got an engine that sounded the way I liked. And just by being a little bit clever with my patching, I could get a lot of the stuff that I got out of this really straight West Coast kind of oscillator. But I got it while still having an East Coast flavor as well.
Sort of, you got the dirt and the grime of the East Coast with the modulation of the West Coast.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great way to look at it. With the triangle-based oscillators, and I think they sound great, but they're very clean sounding.
Yeah.
And the reason is the saw-based oscillators, you can shape a triangle out of it, but there always ends up being a little bit of a hook. You can't get a perfect triangle out of a saw-based oscillator. It's always going to be a touch of a hook. And so you're always going to have some harmonics there that technically shouldn't be there.
Right.
But what it does is it gives it its own sound. And although sort of textbook triangle wave, it's not correct. I haven't met a musician yet that uses that kind of stuff. They go by sound, and that's what we did too. So with that little hook there, you just get this bigger, beefier, sort of gnarlier, dirtier sound out of it, and that's what we love.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I have an O'Toole oscilloscope in my system, and boy, some of the waveforms you wouldn't want to take a kid and say, "Hey, this is what a sine wave looks like," or "Hey, this," I mean, as you say, they're not textbook correct, but boy, they sound good. Is there other places in the system where you said, the correct way is X, but we're going to choose to go direction Y because it's more musical?
Well, we make that decision when we're designing every module. Every decision we make is how musical is it going to be? What features can we add that are going to make this more attractive for a musician, or what are they going to want to use as they're making music? I know what I'm personally interested in, and that's what sort of I fight for when we're sitting down sort of fleshing these ideas out, and everyone else at the shop kind of does the same thing. As far as other modules that aren't exactly textbook, we could talk about probably every single module in the book. A lot of times it comes down to not making something necessarily wrong, but making sort of functionality decisions and taking them away from the musician. So sort of limiting their choices, because we as designers and we as musicians understand that, if you're going to be patching from one module to another module, well, the module you're coming out of is already taken care of a lot of that. So to have redundant feature sets between two different modules is something that we try to avoid.
Sure, right.
So a lot of the times it just comes down to, okay, what is the overall palette that we're trying to present? And let's design a set of modules to provide that. And that goes back to why we make synthesizers and don't focus as much on the individual modules. And the reason is we can make those overall decisions over the span of 5 or 6 modules.
Right.
And then incorporate them into a synthesizer where you look at it together and you go, oh, this makes total sense.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I've actually, prior to getting a system, I had picked up, onesie, twosie Pittsburgh modules to kind of fill in holes in my system. And I was always like, yeah, it does the work, right? But when I got the system, all of a sudden, like the way that everything worked together seemed really clear. And especially, like I said, I have a Foundation 2 system. The left to right layout, all of a sudden, it's almost as if it was designed to be laid out that way, because just where you need a function, Well, there kind of is that module, and that ends up being really a pretty interesting design, and it sounds like you've thought about it that way.
Yeah, well, the foundation specifically, the design was always sort of the idea of the mini Moog.
Right.
Because usability and understandability is so important to us, we thought, let's take the most ubiquitous synthesizer out there, sort of a synth that everyone's going to have some rudimentary understanding of, whether they've actually played one themselves or not. And so the mini Moog really defined that. So it defined the sort of left to right signal flow and, your oscillators, your modulation, your mixers, your filter. And so we just took that design philosophy and say, this is a great way to work. Let's use the same thing, with the idea that someone familiar with synthesizers in general would be able to look at a foundation and say, okay, I don't know this particular synthesizer inside and out, but I do understand, I can see the signal flow because I see the oscillators go into the modulation, into the mixers, into the filters, into the envelopes of VCAs, and then your output. So they can understand the signal flow. And if you can get that, even before you start patching it up, you're halfway there.
Sure.
So again, it's all geared towards a musician making music and not focusing on working the instrument as much as they are is focusing on what sound do I want out of the instrument.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the things you mentioned is that most of the work that you guys do is analog, but you've dabbled in digital a little bit. And I would think, especially with your coding background, that, doing digital stuff would be something that would be interesting, or at least a natural extension of what you're doing. Where do you stand on the digital module thing? And is there a likelihood we're going to see more activity in that realm from Pittsburgh?
Well, I'm pro synthesizer, so I'm not.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot of people that, and I think this number is actually going down quite a bit. That used to be, analog only, no digital, just analog. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I really believe that if it sounds good, it can find a home. And some things digital does that you can't do in analog. So there's some things you need to have a digital module to do, and I think that's great. As far as what Pittsburgh has done, we have our MIDI modules. We have our MIDI 3 module, which is, I think, just a phenomenal MIDI to CD converter. It's got arpeggiators and every frequency or every keyboard response you could ever want. And that was actually the first module that I had programmed. So that was me saying, you know what, I've been out of programming for a little while. Maybe I can get back and give it a shot and see what I can come up with. We needed an upgraded MIDI module. I figured I'd try it myself and see how it went. And if I didn't do a good job, we would outsource it like we had done with the previous MIDI modules. But the results, I had a great time coding it. I really enjoyed it because I was really burned out leaving my job. But some time off. And what I realized, if you're programming music gear, it's a lot more exciting than
databases.
In databases. So I enjoyed programming it enough that, and the response for the MIDI 3 has been phenomenal. So that made me feel good too. So I enjoyed it enough that I said, I'm going to try to do a sequencer module. I think sequencer modules are something that really work well in digital because you can do a lot of features that aren't necessarily impossible in analog, but very large circuits and, end up being very expensive. So we just recently released a module called the Game System, which is based on a PlayStation thumb joystick and a very low-res 8x8 3-color LED matrix display. And the idea is that it has 6 different games, or really they're just 6 different types of sequencers
right,
that you can use to drive your synth. And that, again, is a ton of fun to program, and I think we squeezed every ounce of power and memory we could out of the chips, and came up with something that, although sort of on its surface looks like it might be a little bit of a novelty because it's got the display and it's got a joystick, turns out to be an incredibly powerful sequencer that you can do some really cool music with. So that's what that just started shipping maybe a month or so ago. So we are working on some digital stuff. The sort of more complex DSP style stuff, we do have an engineer that we work with. We had one digital oscillator out already. It was called the Synthtopia Waves.
Mm-hmm.
It was a dual digital oscillator with sort of a frequency-dependent effects processor to blend the two oscillators together. It was very unique. It's sort of, I like the idea of digital kind of celebrating what digital does best.
Sure, that makes sense, right?
Lo-fi, aliasy, kind of rough-sounding oscillators. So the Synthtopia Waves did that, and it did it really well. And we're working with the same guy again on a new digital oscillator called the Double Helix, which is a wavetable-based oscillator, with the same idea that it's a dual wavetable oscillator, and then you have the different processors to blend the waveforms in unique ways. But again, it's very raw, very aliasy, very down and dirty, sort of digital being digital.
Right. Well, and also something that would have a unique place within the Pittsburgh gear, because all the analog stuff around it would be able to do interesting stuff with those highly aliased waves as well.
Oh, absolutely. The digital oscillators, they sound fantastic going through an analog filter.
Right. And there again, that kind of highlights the filter that you've got, which is always a good thing. Well, that sounds interesting, and I'm anxious to try some of these things out. I have to admit, I haven't tried the game system out yet, and I'm glad that you talked about it, because you're right. On the surface, it looks a little, it's a little gamey, and I'm not a game guy, so it was hard for me to imagine it being a musical system. But I could see, if you think of it not as games but as unique or idiosyncratic sequencers, it probably makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things I noticed recently is that you started shipping like a version 2 of most of the modules. And the biggest giveaway is that the front panels have lines on them instead of not. But is there other stuff inside there that people should be paying attention to, or is it mostly a cosmetic update?
Well, they weren't actually called. I think the internet ended up calling them version 2s.
Well, Modular Grid does, which is the
Modular Grid has them on there as version 2s, and that actually caused us some problems because people felt like they weren't getting the latest modules. Really, it's purely cosmetic. We've been over the last year and a half sort of updating our line to a bit of a cleaner look, and we've just recently sort of finished going through everything, so they all have the new look. The modules themselves haven't changed at all. It's the same great sound. It's really, we just wanted a uniform, clean look across the line.
Right, I see. Okay, that makes sense. Now, we've kind of burned through the time, as tends to be the case with this, but I want to ask you one particular question, and that is about the world of modular synthesizer manufacturing in general. I mean, I think that there's a lot of people that would argue that we're currently in the golden age of modular synthesizers, that back in the day when Moog and Buchla were making them, the quantities were low and the costs were incredibly high. But now with manufacturers particularly like you and Depfer, making modules that are, and I don't want to sound dismissive, but they're affordable on a barista's salary, it really opens the door for an awful lot of people to get involved in modular synthesis that would have never been able to get involved before. And so now all of a sudden you're seeing things like Sweetwater carrying modular systems, or Nova Music or some of these other retailers, as well as the modular specific places like Control Voltage. Do you see that being able to expand? Do you think that we can get to a point where a modular synthesizer is kind of a standardized instrument for musicians?
Oh, absolutely. This is just the beginning for modular synthesis. It's sort of I hate to say it's a rebirth, because I don't consider us, I don't feel like we're doing the same thing that they were doing in the late 60s and 70s. What we're doing, we're making sustainable businesses out of this. And because of the technology we have now, we can make them affordable. I kind of like to feel that, very similar to like guitar pedals. Once you have one or two, you want 10. And at the prices that they cost out, you can afford to do that.
Right.
And we can afford to put them out at reasonable prices. What I think, because of laptops and the way that you can have fantastic synthesis in a plug-in on your laptop, you really have to justify your hardware needs now in a different way. And modular gives you something that you can't get with a software plugin. The idea that you have this physical, tangible interaction with something, and that you can build it, and you can use our filter, and you can use the Studio Electronics oscillator, and you can use maybe the Studio Electronics 3003 filter, or the along with the Pittsburgh VCA. That's something that you can't do in software. So I think it's sort of, we are the next evolution in synthesis. They tried it in the 70s, and the technology, the ideas were all there, but the technology was too expensive. Well, now we can do it with the prices where they need to be, so that the next generation of musicians, the kids in high school and the kids in college, can afford to buy systems. Maybe not giant systems, but they can afford to use modular synthesis to do something that no one's heard before.
Right.
And that's the big difference.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because you mentioned that, even like college students could buy something, but maybe not a big system. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is that in the modular world, you don't need to have an enormous system to get something that sounds unique and really kind of personal. People find ways to patch sounds that match their personalities or match their emotional state or whatever. It's one of the magical things about modular systems that I have to admit that I just love.
I have a small recording studio in my home, and my modular there is for someone that owns a modular synthesis company is very modest. I have a Move 104 case full of modules, and that's what I use to make music with.
Oh, that's great.
Because I've curated it down to, this is what I need to do the type of music that I enjoy to play.
Right.
Now, I use other synthesizers as well. I have a Tuno 106, and I have some other stuff that I just cherish and I love to use on tracks. But, modular is part of everything I do, but I have a very stripped down system because it gives me everything that I need.
That's a really great thing. I mean, it's funny you say that, because I think everyone's imagination of what a modular synth owner's house must look like is that you don't even have wallpaper. You just have modules covering all of the walls, right? And so it's kind of interesting that you found that actually restricting things makes you do what you love. So that's cool.
But I've worked like that forever, down to working with cassette tape recorders instead of laptops, because I thought it was getting in the way. But I like simple and easy.
Yeah.
I like the idea that if I can move it and sit on my porch if I want to.
Yeah, that's always a fun perspective, right? Well, Richard, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your surely busy schedule to talk with me and with my listeners. This is a fantastic discussion, and I wish you the best. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
All right, have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
I want to thank Richard for spending the time with me on that. It was a fantastic interview. I learned an awful lot about Pittsburgh. I'm sure you did too. I want to thank Jim and Elisabeth over at Synthtopia for helping pull this one together. They really did some nice front-end work to help me get Richard's attention. But all in all, I just am really happy to, anytime I get a chance to talk to modular people. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks a lot for listening. Make sure you tune in next week. And if you got time in between, catch up on some old episodes. We're getting an awful, wonderful backlog out there, and I'd love for you to really embrace some of the work that we've done. So thank you so much. Catch you next week. Bye.